Chris French is a professor of psychology at Goldsmith College, University of London, where he heads up the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit. As a professor of psychology, what it is specifically in the first place that made you attracted to the phenomena of conspiracy theories?
I got interested in conspiracy theories mainly because my area of anomalistic psychology is typically focused on why people believe in the paranormal, what kinds of experiences might underlie those beliefs, and I'm approaching this very much from a skeptical perspective. I used to, as a teenager, believe in all this stuff, but the more psychology I learned, the more I realized that there were various ways that you could actually fool yourself, that you might have hallucinatory experiences, the unreliability of human memory, biases in the way that we process information, and so on and so forth. And within that world of the paranormal, conspiracy theories crop up time and time again. I mean, most notably with respect to, say, UFO claims. I mean, the world of ufology is absolutely rife with conspiracy theories, as I'm sure you'll be aware. And there are some very interesting parallels between the kind of likely reasoning processes or problems with reasoning that, in my opinion, underlie belief in the paranormal, would also seem to apply in the case of belief in conspiracies, and perhaps even belief, religious beliefs. So there's an interesting kind of triad there. Um, and well, basically, that's how I got interested in it in the first place. And as has happened with a few other interesting psychological phenomena, I've then kind of just become interested in it in its own right, whether or not it relates to paranormal conspiracies. So at the moment, I mean, I have two PhD students working in this area, and various other kind of collaborations and projects on the go. And I think another thing about it, I think, is that it's, although conspiracy theories have been the subject of quite a lot of research in the social sciences generally, very little of it up until quite recently has come from psychologists. And I think that's kind of very surprising when you look at the implications of belief in conspiracies, and the fact that, okay, a lot of the time, I think perfectly reasonable to say that these kinds of beliefs don't really do that much harm. But you can also look at some areas, like the way that they affect health-related behavior, the fact that lots of extremist acts are carried out by people who believe in conspiracies, that they can actually do real damage. And I think, kind of over and above all that, just the fact that conspiracy theories are so rife and so appealing and endorsed at such a high level at all, levels of society, is a kind of, it says we're doing something wrong educationally. We're not giving people the right tools to critically evaluate these kinds of claims. So for all those reasons, I think it's a really fruitful area, and I'm glad to see that certainly over recent years, there's now quite a number of psychologists in the UK and around the world who are actively pursuing research in this area.
The points you raised there were very interesting in terms of errors in logical forms of reasoning, not just in conspiracy theories, but also religious belief and belief in the supernatural. With this in mind, I'd like you to expand on the similarities to a certain extent between conspiracy theory and religious belief and belief in the supernatural in terms of seeking out agency. That is, the human mind to a certain extent is predisposed to seek out agency. That's one form that can act as a catalyst for driving increased belief in conspiracy theories.
Yes, sure. I mean, again, there are various different angles, different aspects to this. You mentioned yourself there that all three areas involve this kind of natural predisposition that we have to perceive agency where perhaps it's not appropriate. And I mean, in very general terms, the argument would be that the way that the human mind works, that the mind has evolved, or the brain has evolved, primarily to keep us alive. It's about physical survival. It's not about apprehending the truth with a capital T. And yeah, as a consequence of that, we tend to think in terms. We use heuristics, very quick and dirty rules of thumb that usually give us the right answer very quickly, as opposed to another form of thinking which is slower, more reflective, likely to be right slightly more often, but the cost-benefit analysis is such that it makes sense in evolutionary terms to come to a quick decision that's usually right, because any delay in coming to a decision might actually be costly. Now, as I say, when you think about it from that kind of evolutionary perspective, we have a tendency to make certain kinds of errors over others. So we tend to it's safer to assume agency, to assume that events happen around us because someone or something made them happen, rather than it was just kind of some random occurrence. And again, just in the kind of cost-benefit analysis there is that there's not a great cost to assuming that there was some kind of agent behind that event if it turns out that there wasn't. But to assume that there wasn't when it turns out that there was, again, in evolutionary terms, we might be talking about predatory animals, we might be talking about enemies who are going to attack us, and so on. And so the bias is in that direction. And that kind of sense of agency that we perceive around what may well be just kind of random occurrences has obvious applications with respect to not only conspiracy theories, but also religious beliefs and paranormal beliefs relating to things like ghosts, etc., etc. So that sense of agency is a very important factor. Another important factor is the tendency to see meaning in randomness. And this is a topic that I promise I won't, but I could talk about for hours. I mean, it's fascinating the way that we do this, and we do it in all kinds of different areas of life. I mean, Michael Shermer refers to it as patternicity. And again, there is a good reason why we do it, because, I mean, for one thing, the reason that we are so successful as a species is because we are very good at picking up on patterns and regularities and cause and effect relationships in the environment around us. The price that we pay is that sometimes we see those kinds of connections when they're not really there. And as it's kind of fairly mundane, trivial level, we might see faces in clouds, we might see patterns in random numbers, etc., etc. We're really not very good at either generating randomness or recognizing it when it's there. What we are maybe a bit too good at is making connections between things, seeing correspondences when maybe they aren't really there, when it's actually, we're making an error in cognitive terms by doing that. As I say, it makes sense in evolutionary terms, in terms of the cost-benefit analysis, that's the way that the human mind has evolved. There are other cognitive biases that come into play as well. I mean, perhaps kind of the most pervasive cognitive bias that affects us all is confirmation bias. We all of us, anybody who says, and you do occasionally hear people saying this, that they are just kind of neutral assessors of the evidence. Well, from a psychological point of view, that's extremely naive. There's no such thing. To be human is to be biased. We have preconceptions. We might change our beliefs, but then we just have a different set of preconceptions. And we take from the available evidence around us, from whatever sources that may be, we tend to notice the things that support our pre-existing beliefs. We have reasons to dismiss any evidence that goes against those beliefs. And I mean, there's lots of evidence of this, whether, again, various different levels of the cognitive system, but even at a very basic level of, say, syllogistic reasoning, just purely logical reasoning, we will spot the errors in reasoning if an argument comes to a conclusion that we don't agree with, whereas we're much less likely to notice any errors in reasoning if the conclusion that's arrived at is one that we do already endorse. So I say there's lots of evidence for that. Some of these things have been looked at specifically in the context of conspiracy beliefs. So, for example, one study looked at confirmation bias by presenting participants with various arguments that either endorsed and supported the lone gunman theory of the JFK assassination, or evidence that seemed to contradict that theory. But the same evidence was presented to everybody, and what the results showed was that the people who were already believers in a conspiracy theory relating to the JFK assassination uh, basically concluded that the evidence that they've been presented with supported that point of view, and in fact they became more conspiratorial in their. And equally, those who did not endorse the conspiracy theory actually polarized in their views. So it's not just something that affects the believers and not the non-believers. We're all prone to this kind of bias. In some other interesting work by Whitson and Galinsky, they looked at this tendency that we have to see patterns where they're not there. And also in one of the 6 studies that they did to think in conspiratorial terms, and they showed them with experimental manipulations that these factors seem to be associated with a loss of a sense of control. Again, that makes sense in terms of the kind of bigger picture, that at the societal level, it's when people feel that things are out of control, looking for some kind of explanatory framework that perhaps conspiracy theories can provide.
Yes, other research in this area has also shown that when people feel somewhat aggrieved or have had misfortunes upon their life, that they feel less in control and therefore more likely to advocate some kind of supernatural or extra agent being. That is something that is not plausible as an explanation in the social world. Now, evidence and confirmation bias is very interesting, especially in the conspiracy theory domain. All humans, all rational thinking creatures use confirmation bias to some extent. What evidence plays a part in conspiracy theories is very interesting. For example, when conspiracy theorists are confronted with the logical framework that evidence comes out that doesn't support their conspiracy theory, the conspiracy theory changes and embellishes the conspiracy theory even further using the evidence that's come to light. So it then becomes a regressive form of social explanation in terms of how one is linking the evidence available to the explanation that's available. There's an essay in this I wrote for the Skeptic magazine called Conspiracy Theory, a Pseudo Theory, and the essence of it, if I can give you an example that really brings it home, is this. There is a popular conspiracy theory that the US presidents, not only all white, but a majority of them went to Yale University and come from the infamous conspiratorial secret club, the Skull and Bones. Now, what happens when a black man who went to Harvard becomes president? Well, you can't just say that the Skull and Bones here isn't working. So you then advocate something like the Black Freemasons Club or the Black Skull and Bones Club. And this is the organisation that helps, like any other secret society, it helps black people come to preeminent positions of power, which, apart from being quite hilarious, is incredibly insulting. With these kind of psychological dispositions and odd forms of self-justification and reasoning, what has some of your research shown about what kind of personality traits people have that make them more susceptible to believe not just in one conspiracy theory, but many conspiracy theories that may not even be related.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some interesting work looking at kind of possible personality variables that might lead certain individuals to be um, more drawn to belief in conspiracies. I mean, again, I suppose we should say, and I know that you accept this, as I think anybody with a serious interest in this area would, that of course conspiracies do take place. This research that is saying, oh no conspiracies ever take place. Of course they do. And it may even be that some of the ideas that are currently kind of bracketed in with the non-accepted, not generally accepted conspiracy theories, one or two of them may even turn out to be true. I mean, I doubt it, but it's possible. You know, we can't know. Um, but what we do know is that conspiracy theories are kind of coming out, particularly on the internet, seconds of major world events before anyone has time to know, to gather the information relating to that particular event. We know from experimental studies that you can actually just make up a conspiracy theory off the top of your head on the basis of no evidence whatsoever, and then use that in an experiment, and some people will endorse it. We know also that the single biggest factor that relates to whether or not someone will endorse a particular conspiracy theories is, do they endorse other conspiracy theories, even those that seem to be totally unrelated. So, there's no obvious connection that I can see between the idea that the moon landings were faked and JFK assassination was the result of a conspiracy, and yet if you endorse one, you are much more likely to endorse the other. Some interesting research by Karen Douglas and her team at Kent University shows recently that people will even endorse mutually contradictory conspiracies. So they looked at the degree to which you believe that Princess Di faked her own death correlates positively with the degree to which you would endorse claims that her death was the result of a conspiracy. Now, obviously, those things can't. And similarly, you find that that you get a similar effect with respect to Osama bin Laden. People who claim that he was actually killed years ago also are more likely to endorse the claim that he's still alive. Now both of those can't be true. What you've got, of course, in the explanation here is that people really are just saying, we doubt the official version. We believe the official version. Something else is going on. Might not know what it is, but something else is going on. But back to your original question. When you actually look at the kind of personality correlates which seem to show a correlation, and again, I should emphasize here that, as I said at the outset, there's not been a huge amount of research, and there is a real need for kind of replication of some of these effects, but there's a reasonably consistent pattern that emerges. You do find that there's a correlation with, perhaps not surprisingly, with levels of paranoia. We're not talking about clinical levels here, but these days we tend to think of these kinds of traits as being on a continuum rather than, you're either paranoid or you're not. We all have different levels. And that there's also a correlation with various other measures of what's called schizotypy, which again, paranoia is one example of a symptom on that kind of measure. There's this again is not surprising, the paranoia link, because obviously if you distrust those around you, then you are more likely to kind of endorse conspiracy type beliefs. What's interesting is that this doesn't just apply to distrust of big institutions and governments and so on. It also applies at the very personal level. If you're less likely to even trust your own friends and neighbours and those who are actually quite close to you. Other kinds of personality factors. I mean, on the positive side, there's some evidence that suggests that openness to new ideas correlates with endorsement of and belief in conspiracy theories. Again, not perhaps too surprising, because if you kind of are intellectually curious, you might be more drawn to kind of ideas that are out there on the fringe, and maybe spend more time immersing yourself in that kind of literature and those kinds of ideas. Uh, as I said earlier, there's a correlation with paranormal belief as well. So, the belief in things that are kind of maybe not generally accepted, or at least not by the official version of the way things are supposed to be. Um, and some interesting work again by Karen Douglas, has shown that people who conspiracy beliefs tend to be people who by their own self-report say that they would actually engage in conspiracy behavior if they found themselves in certain contexts. I was at a conference a few months ago where Karen was presenting some of this work, and didn't go down too well with the conspiracy theorists in the crowd.
Okay, one area that we've previously touched upon is whether there can be a rational justification for believing in a conspiracy theory. The problem with this kind of single mode analytical form of thinking is that not all conspiracy theories are the same, and some are more plausibly true than others. This is because, of course, conspiracies do actually exist. So, one way to decipher whether a conspiracy exists or not would be limits of evidence, practical reasoning, and the available resources for execution on behalf of the conspirators. Now, this isn't made any easier by the multi-complex phenomena involving conspiracies, because conspiracy theories happen every day and in different contexts. So, for example, your family members could conspire against you to plan a birthday party that you're not aware of. Of course, this isn't a malevolent political or social conspiracy, but it is a conspiracy in terms of secret operations with a desired goal. With this in mind, because there are different forms of conspiracies and different conspiracy theories, what do you think is one of the primary causes for the rise in conspiracy theories, popular conspiracy theories, that have entered the popular political world over the last few decades?
At the risk of stating the being obvious, as the saying goes, the old internet has obviously got a huge role to play here. That starts, as I said earlier, within minutes of any major world event, there are people blogging about it on the internet, and the conspiracy theorists, those people are really deeply immersed in that mindset. It doesn't matter what, if something happens tonight that is, is of major world significance, the conspiracy theorists will be already viewing it through their particular lens, their particular way of sense of it. So they'll be blogging about it. So that information is there, is very readily available. The other thing the internet does is obviously it allows like-minded people to find each other and to feed off each other in terms of ideas. And you know, I mean, with any, I mean, the point is, of course, that real life is messy. There will be, I mean, and particularly in the early stages after, say, some major disaster has taken place, then there will be, you know, bits of information that are coming out that turn out not to be true. There'll be things that are kind of seem anomalous and unexplained, and it's those very anomalies that the conspiracy theories then kind of feed on. But I think the internet has just kind of magnified that tendency that was already there. So whereas it probably took quite a while for conspiracy theories about the JFK assassination to kind of consolidate and crystallize. This kind of thing just happens at such a rapid rate. And of course, the nature of conspiracy theories about any really complex major world event, 9/11 being the kind of prime example, I suppose, is there are so many different aspects to it. It was such a complicated thing to try and get your head around that, as anybody who's ever tried to talk to a conspiracy theorist will know, trying to kind of nail down the arguments is like trying to nail jelly to the wall. You kind of say, okay, but yeah, actually, the third tower didn't. It wasn't free fall, and then they'll switch from that. Yeah, okay, so but how do you explain this then? And there are just so many. I mean, so many different arguments that they'll come up with, and you could spend all night arguing with them and try and answer each and every point, but you still would not convince them. I mean, one thing I meant to say earlier, you said something that made me think of this earlier, that it's in the very nature of conspiracy theories to, they're a prime example of a generally, of a non-falsifiable hypothesis. Um, the I mean, in very general terms, if you have what appears to be contradictory evidence, then it was obviously just put there by the conspirators. The conspirators are seen as being kind of all powerful and hyper competent, and yet they seem to sometimes make really, really, really basic errors. You look at the kind of Apollo the moon landings hoax. Sorry, well, the idea that it was a hoax, and so some of the things there that I'm sure Stanley Kubrick would have got right. These conspirators with all these vast resources at their disposal, they made some very basic errors. Well, of course, they didn't at all. All things can be explained, but you've got this interesting view of the conspirators as being kind of almost omnipotent and hyper competent on the one hand, but making some really dumb errors allow these people who are in the know to actually expose them for what they really are, or at least that's the way they view it. And again, I think that's an important psychological aspect of it, that the people who are in on the conspiracy do get a sense of kind of insight. They've got insider knowledge. They know things that society in general doesn't know. They've got this special knowledge, and so that I think counts for an awful lot in their world. And another little point to make here, which while I think about it, is that I think it would be very interesting to. I think most of the research, because obviously this is the way it is, much easier to get hold of a broad range of people, some of whom believe in conspiracy theories, some of whom don't, the whole range. It would be really interesting if somebody had the opportunity to do some research on not the kind of followers, if you like, but on the people like David Icke, who right there at the top, because I think you'd have a very different psychological profile there. Whereas I think most of the followers would tend to be people who, by and large, felt relatively powerless and alienated and not in control of events. I think people like David Icke and Alex Jones would see themselves as being very powerful and with some justification. They have a huge following. They are very influential people.
Yes, I would completely agree with all of that there. I was having this same conversation with the Canadian Skeptic Society in terms of the psychology and the motivation that drives the key players in the conspiracy theory game, such as David Icke and Alex Jones, and it is different from those that follow them and also believe in their conspiracies. So we've got something akin to the Messiah complex for those that are supposedly unraveling the conspiratorial truths that makes them almost superhuman in a certain extent. And then you've got the mindless sheep, the tribes of people that follow and advocate these conspiracy theories because they may feel powerless or they're forms of rival political explanations. And this in itself turns the whole conspiracy theory movement into a political and social movement, because obviously you're endorsing alternative forms of social, political and economic explanations. With this kind of widespread phenomenon at the macro level occurring, to what extent could one say that this kind of psychological reasoning, when it comes to not just conspiracy theories, but conspiracy theories that are logically inconsistent. So the perfect example is the Osama bin Laden one, which is essentially the story about how people do not believe the official account in and of itself, even when the conspiracy theory can contradict itself. So Bin Laden died 2 weeks ago. No, he died 4 years ago. With this kind of motivation, how reasonable is it to say that conspiracy theories and their movements on large scales become something like a contagion or pathology, either social psychologically or politically?
I mean, again, I know, I mean, certain colleagues who are doing research in this area are very, very wary, and I think with good reason, of kind of labeling conspiracy believers as suffering from any kind of pathology. And one of the main arguments they would use is to say, well, just look at the levels of endorsement. Unless you're prepared to say that half the population is crazy, it doesn't make any sense to equate belief in conspiracies with psychopathology. My reply would be, I think we need to be a bit more nuanced than that, because the kind of current understanding of psychopathology, as I kind of said in passing before, is not that you either are suffering from a particular psychiatric disorder or that you're not. It's much more of a continuum approach. So you can have some people would score very, very low on any measure of schizotypical thinking, kind of have never some people would never have had any kind of even mildly anomalous experiences in their lives. Maybe I suspect Richard Dawkins would come out very, very low if we were to ever get the chance to give him a scale to fill in. Others obviously are actually, clinically suffering from psychopathology that they do need treatment for, they do need help with. But there's a huge range in between. Uh, I think it's in that range in between that we can look at the possible influence of these kinds of factors. So to have a mild degree of paranoia, I mean, there's, some researchers argue that they find in their own research that there is a correlation between level of paranoia and endorsement of conspiracist beliefs, but actually argue that although this might be problematic when the levels of paranoia become too high, moderate levels might actually be quite helpful. Because let's face it, you know, there are people out there who are sometimes out to rip you off and, not to play fair. So to have a certain level of suspiciousness is probably not too unhealthy. We're dealing with a continuum here. So any kind of very kind of crude equating of endorsement conspiracies with psychopathology, as I say, I don't think it really stands up. But the idea that some of those underlying tendencies might actually be relevant, and then I think where it gets really interesting then is to try and look at the the underlying cognitive factors. I mean, for example, one of my PhD students at the moment is looking at the possible relationship between tendency towards delusional thought and um, belief in conspiracies. And we've found in a few studies in the past that using kind of standard measures of tendency towards delusional thinking, yes, it correlates with endorsement of conspiracy theories. And the interesting thing that we're trying to look at is whether there's a lot of work that's looked at the underlying cognitive factors that lead to delusional thought. And one of them in particular is the tendency it's called the jump to conclusions bias. The idea that certain individuals will jump to kind of very strongly held beliefs on the basis of very partial evidence. And that obviously seems very relevant, to me at least, when we're talking about belief in conspiracy theories. And so we are directly trying to look at that and see whether we can find any evidence to show that there is a link there. as I say, we've only just started kind of on that line of research. So I'll get back to you when we've done a few more studies. But you know, that's the kind of way in which research in one area of psychology can kind of usefully feed into asking other questions in other areas.
Now, in terms of the problems of measurement and conceptual representation, one problem that we can both appreciate is that it's often tempting to treat conspiracy theories as one model of phenomena and investigation. Of course, there are different types of conspiracy theories, and this makes it more problematic when distinguishing between plausible and existing conspiracy theories and ludicrous and irrational conspiracy theories. With this problem, how is it in your research and the research of your PhD students that you are defining an optimal form of conspiracy theory, i.e., what constitutes a conspiracy theory, and then that you use that definition as a research tool and a benchmark for establishing the very conceptual definitions of conspiracy theory for further study. So essentially, how one is defining the phenomena that it seeks to study, and then how we can take this and then use our understanding of it to see the beliefs that people have in this defined phenomena.
No, I mean that's an excellent question, and one that my PhD student, one of my PhD students, Robert Brotherton, uh, started out by kind of trying to get some kind of a handle on that, because what a lot of the psychological well, all of the previous psychological studies had done, they had tended to measure conspiracist thinking in terms of one or maybe just a couple, a few specific conspiracies, and um, and obviously there are problems with that. I mean, there's some very useful information come out of it. Not saying that the research wasn't worth doing, uh, but one of the limitations there is that things become kind of very context specific there, because what might be a big conspiracy in one country might be unheard of in another country, and similarly things change over time. What's a very topical conspiracy at one point in time may fade, and people don't have any interest in it. And so Rob did was to try to develop a new scale, a kind of generic conspiracy scale, because you realize, well, we realized through discussing it and looking at the previous literature, that there are certain generic themes that run through conspiracy. Rather than asking a question specifically about the JFK assassination, to ask a question about whether there are kind of powerful groups who might try to influence world events behind the scenes, but possibly by means of assassination, or to ask whether there might be, governments might act in such a way as to conceal information from the general public, or conspiracies related to, UFO related conspiracies, for example. And what Rob did with that was to identify around about 5 main themes that pretty much seem to cover all of the kind of major conspiracies, as in on the world, the international level. So not necessarily that, you thought your neighbor was, or your neighbors were conspiring against you to either plan a party or kill your cat or whatever. But certainly the kind of major conspiracies that most of this research relates to did fall into quite a limited number of categories. And so what we've done is to produce a generic conspiracies scale that we hope could be used by everybody, so that it makes it easier to kind of compare results from different studies, because we're all using the same scale and so on. So that was the first phase of the research, which in itself took quite a lot of time. And now what we intend to do is to use that scale to, on the one hand, see if by using that scale we replicate some of the effects that have been previously reported by other researchers, and also obviously to look at some new down into some new avenues that haven't yet been looked into. I mean, I'll give you one example of uh, what Rob Rob did for his MSc thesis was looking at something called the conjunction fallacy. Sorry, no, it's not the conjunction fallacy. Yeah, I think that's right. It's conjunction fallacy. Uh, Without going into the details, it's a reasoning error which previous research had already shown was correlated with paranormal belief. We wondered if it might also be related to conspiratorial thinking. And long story short, yes, it turns out it is. You know, and so there are some of these kind of quite esoteric reasoning errors that do seem to show relationships with this type of thinking. And there's a very, very you know, rich area for research because, as I said before, to date, although it is changing, I think the people in this country psychologists who have done or are doing interesting research in this area. There's obviously Karen Douglas and her team. There's Viren Swamy at the University of Westminster. Patrick Lehman has done some really interesting work. Me and my team at Goldsmiths. And Jovan Byford. We have an invited speaker series at Goldsmiths. And we have two speakers in the coming series that will be talking directly about the psychology of belief in conspiracies. We've got Joban Byford and Adrian Furnham coming. So if any of your listeners are interested in coming to these talks, they are free. They're open to the public. There's no need to book. Go to the Goldsmiths website. And if you can find your way to the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit website, there's a list of talks that are on. That's the APRU. And as I say, any of your listeners who are interested in attending, it'd be great if they came along.
Of course, scale measurement is always a tricky and complex procedure, particularly when dealing with social phenomena and the cognitive phenomena of individuals in the social world. But at least it's good to see that you and your students have made some headway there in terms of the measurements on the scale, just boiling down these elements to the most abstract fundamental forms that are then generally and widely applicable to this phenomena in different contexts. Now, some of the work that I have done that involved analysing conspiracy theories from across the broad spectrum of the social sciences in an area that doesn't specifically look at the social psychology of conspiracy theories is to look at how conspiracy theories that postulate some kind of social, political, or economic activity can alternatively be explained by other paradigms in the social sciences. For example, take one of the most popular conspiracy theories of the last few decades, which is the Bilderberg Group. Here, open and shut case of a conspiracy theory would be that international elites get in a room together and formulate and dictate global policy for the next few years in what appears to be a very simple format and fashion, as if they're running a film, and then these policies get enacted on a global scale. Now, initially, the first thing that may come to mind is how is this feasible in terms of the disparate networks that are needed to do this across the world, but we'll leave that aside for one moment. But if you look at why a group like the Bilderberg Group would behave in the way they do, then you can use the school of realism, for example, in international relations, which is in the absence of a supranational sovereign international body that has dominion over nation states. We don't have this in the world. So one way of getting together and solving these gaps in international political domains is by having elites come together and discuss problems facing the world today. So far from it being a conspiracy in a secret smoke-filled room, it's actually a practical response to the absence of an international regulatory framework, and that's why we have conventions like the Bilderberg Group. Also, if you look at the global financial crisis, would it necessarily have to be explained by the, say, top draconian 1% in the world who control most of the resources and that they deliberately crash these economic systems to increase financial reward from it? Or is this just an endemic part of the financial system itself, in which investment banks, under a capitalist guise, their prime motivation is to increase returns on investments, and with statistical modelling and excessive greed, these models and methods of increasing return on investments don't always work out. So we run into economic problems, large-scale economic problems, which has repercussions across the international financial and political domain. So these are two examples where conspiratorial explanations for unwanted economic and political positions can in themselves be explained by theoretical frameworks in the social sciences. And another one, of course, is aggressive international corporatism, which is a bedrock of the capitalist movement. Without even having to be a Marxist in any way, this is how international corporations are set up to exist and thrive, which is increasing the return. Now, these are some of the ways in which the social sciences themselves, both in terms of research and experimentation, as well as theoretical explanations, can not only, from my perspective, deal with large-scale conspiracy theories, but also explain them in more efficient, alternative fashions than just proposing that it's all the will of secret agents, which seems a bit too reductionist, a bit too simplistic, and overwhelmingly oversubscribes the available power and resources that certain agencies and structures can employ in different forms across the social sciences. And I think this is a very illuminating and important way to see how one can use the broad spectrum of the social sciences to at least make some sense and understanding of what conspiracy theories are, what they do, what's the differences between them, and what are the social and political motivations behind endorsing them. Now, returning to the psychological aspects of conspiracy theories, if you could just let us know what your centre, the Centre for Anomalistic Studies at Goldsmith College, University of London, what it will be doing in the future and what some of your future projects are and future goals.
Right. Well, we're working on lots of things. I mean, the conspiracy theory stuff is one of our most active areas at the moment. As I said before, PhD students who are doing research in that area. Myself and Viren Swami will be co-editing a special issue of Frontiers in Psychology, which is an online journal, and this special issue is devoted to the psychology of belief in conspiracy theories. So we'll be, looking at those papers as they're submitted and so on and so forth. So there should be some interesting findings coming out from that. In other areas, and again, the thing is, it's always amazing the way that these things all tend to interrelate. Another area that I'm very interested in is the whole area of false memories. And of course, you find there that there's an element of conspiracy theories in there, because you get these claims of some international network of satanic ritual abuse. And of course, it's not supported by a single shred of hard forensic evidence, but there are all kinds of ways that the people who believe that these things are happening manage to explain that away. That's the nature of conspiracy theories. I mean, you mentioned, we've got Stephen Law coming to do a talk, and of course, Stephen talks about intellectual black holes. The certain belief systems, and conspiracy theories tend to be a very good example, that are just impervious to contradictory evidence. Any contradictory evidence that comes along can just be whacked away. It doesn't have to be taken seriously. So I mean, I've got an ongoing interest in the relationship between susceptibility to false memories and belief in the paranormal and reports of paranormal experiences. Um, all these things do seem to intercorrelate. That's what fascinates me so much. The underlying personality factors tend to be very similar across these different areas that I'm interested in. What else have we got coming up this year? Oh, there's just and lots of really interesting stuff. Check out the website. That would be the best, the best way to find out, to keep up with what we're doing. Um, but yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the reasons that people have, the facts that lead them to believe in what frankly I find to be some very, very, very implausible ideas, and that includes the vast majority of what we'd call conspiracy theories. That's what fascinates me. I want to know, why people believe this stuff, and hopefully we'll come up with some answers.
So when we look at conspiracy theories, fundamentally one way of approaching this, and this is the insights that psychologists bring to it, like other phenomena that aren't readily applicable to some kind of evidence and refutation, so the supernatural, belief in deities and conspiracy theories, the abstract function that underpins them all isn't about the kind of phenomena that we see in the world external to this, that it's much more likely, and the evidence is starting to suggest it's the nature of beliefs themselves.
Absolutely, absolutely.